I think that they actually thought that it would be as it were, a 9-day wonder. And I don't think that they thought that she was ever going to win an election. In fact, I can remember in those early days, even after she became Prime Minister, the general assumption was that, she'd be a one-term inhabitant of number 10.
Wary of those around her, she was also patronised by Labour MPs and even the then Prime Minister, James Callaghan.
If the Tory party were uncertain about Margaret Thatcher, and many of them were when she was leader of the opposition, the Labour government, the Labour Party, was equally uncertain of her. They took a very nasty and unpleasant approach to her in the House of Commons, catcalling, deriding her, using squeaking voices to try to humiliate her. They were very well organised at trying to undermine her confidence, and they pursued it to some pretty ferocious and unfriendly degrees. Jim Callaghan also used to patronise her across the dispatch box. And I remember her at times going into the House of Commons almost shaking with, not anxiety, but frustration, because she knew that she was going to go in there and receive a terrible battering on the part of the Labour Party, and perhaps not get the entire support of the Conservative Party behind her.
Where Margaret might struggle to maintain her supremacy within the parliamentary party, among grassroots Conservatives, her particular brand of bossy, no-nonsense politics and habitual references to good housekeeping made her a popular figure.
Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I presume this is to enable us to sweep Britain clean of socialism.
She enunciated very clearly the fight that most Tories were involved in and really wanted to see pursued with some energy, and that was the fight against creeping socialism.
Hello, dear. Of course. Have you been across...
The novelty of a woman as leader of the Tory party also lent Mrs. Thatcher a certain celebrity status.
Lovely dark red colour, isn't it? Much prettier than the House of Commons. It's half-term, dear. Can I borrow that to sign this one?
And, unusually for the leader of the opposition, Margaret Thatcher also attracted attention from abroad, most notably due to a speech she made in 1976, when she pronounced Russia as hell-bent on world domination. The Soviet news agency responded by labelling her the Iron Lady.
Mrs. Thatcher went very much against the grain of the Western world in the mid-70s on the whole question of the Soviet Union. This was an era of détente, and particularly President Carter was pushing it forward, and the SALT talks and all this sort of thing, and the Helsinki process. And Mrs. Thatcher was highly sceptical about this and was influenced by some rather unusual thinkers, some of whom were actually in Russia, such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn, or came out of Russia, and others in the West, like Bob Conquest, who'd written all about the Great Terror and Stalin. And she wanted to sound the alarm about A, Soviet military expansion, and B, Soviet subversion in the West.
I stand before you tonight in my red star chiffon evening gown.
It was the start of the Soviets' fascination with Mrs. Thatcher, and inadvertently it gave her an identity as an international, not just domestic, politician. It was an image she would return to many times throughout her leadership.
The Iron Lady of the Western world.
She had the wit to see that this was the most wonderful gift to her, because what you need above all is recognition when you're the leader of the opposition. And there it was, the enemy had said she was the Iron Lady. They meant it as an insult. She took it, quite rightly, as a compliment.
Mrs. Thatcher's period as leader of the opposition also gave her an opportunity to fully develop the ideology she would then pursue in power.
We look back on her story now and we think she kind of blazed into the firmament, fully formed. And she didn't. It took several years in opposition, from 1975 to 79, when she began to do a lot of the thinking and commissioned a lot of the original thinking. All the political philosophy of the time was left-wing. There was nothing there. Margaret had to start doing it from scratch, and with the help of people like Keith Joseph and Alfred Sherman and the economists, she started to think through how you switch the economy from the very poor shape it was in, the sclerotic state it was in, into something much more dynamic.
She thought we have to rethink everything. This country is being ruined. It's being ruined by collectivism, socialism, inflation, too much trade union power, and by our own conservative failure to deal with these problems. And so that's what she started to think about. And in doing so, she combined a radicalism, that's to say a readiness to think of remedies that were quite different, for example, how she was going to tackle inflation, with a conservatism in the sense that she was wishing to bring back what she saw as traditional British qualities, which she felt had been sacrificed by socialism or by defeatism.
4 years into a Labour government and a string of bad by-elections had left Labour dependent on the Liberals and other parties to get their legislation through Parliament. The unions too were at war with the government over its attempt to keep pay rises below 5%. A winter of discontent in 1978 to early 1979, with public sector unions on strike, newspaper headlines about the dead being left unburied, and rubbish and rats on the streets, all contributed to Callaghan's woes. Margaret Thatcher was blunt in her assessment of the crisis and in her opinion of union activists and how they damaged the union cause.
Now, these few men are the wreckers in our midst. They're not the massive trade unionists, but there are a few militants who are the wreckers. And I think they do as much damage to the decent name of trade unionism as they do to our economy.
She perfectly understood that the trade unions should exist, that Labour needed representation at the workplace. But she was shocked by how ordinary trade unionists had almost no power because there was so little democracy in the system. And she was shocked by how that led to manipulation by the hard left. And she also believed that the trade unions, even when they were led by moderates, should not be making the economic policy of the country.
The collapse of the Lib-Lab Pact and the rejection of moves towards devolution in Scotland further weakened Callaghan's position,